On June 25, 1950, 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army rushed across the 38th parallel, a boundary drawn up between the United States and the Soviet Union, which separated Korea into North and South, with the North communist and firmly aligned with the Soviet Union, and the South democratic and aligned with the United States. 1 month later, the United States would enter the war, anxious to achieve a quick armistice with the North out of fear of dragging in the Soviet Union or China and launching World War III. But how did a war that would last to this day begin? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're telling the story of the Korean War. Korea was seized as part of the Japanese Empire early on in the 20th century. After a stunning defeat of Russia, the world was forced to accept that Japan was a new world power, and Japan itself was eager to add to its territories. Unfortunately for the people of Korea, this meant that the Japanese army would occupy the nation until the end of World War II. Upon Japan's defeat, however, something needed to be done about its former imperial holdings. As part of its unconditional surrender, Japan was forced to recall its armies in Asia back to its home island, and to give up most of its overseas territories. Yet, while Manchuria would be returned to the Chinese, nobody had any idea about what to do with Korea. Ultimately, the nation was divided along the 38th parallel, and in a bid to seek to pacify the Soviet Union, Soviet forces were allowed to take control of the North, and the Americans would take control of the South. Nobody, by the way, had bothered to ask the Koreans what they themselves wanted. By 1950, the South was controlled by anti-communist dictator Syngman Rhee, which the US very reluctantly supported. The North, however, was enthusiastically supported by the Soviet Union, who had installed Kim Il-sung as its leader. Both men wanted to reunify Korea under their own rule, and border skirmishes between the two nations were common, with almost 10,000 troops killed in battle before the war officially began. Then came the major offensive from the North in the summer of 1950. For the United States, the conflict was not a border dispute between two rival nations, but rather part of a larger and growing struggle between the forces of communism and democracy. The United States considered non-interference an impossibility, and a secret National Security Council report even recommended that the United States use military force to contain communist expansionism anywhere in the world, regardless of the intrinsic strategic or economic value of the lands in question. For the US, the die was cast, and what was quickly seen as a war of aggression backed by the Soviet Union was met with US troops. President Harry Truman would go on to say, "If we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another." This anti-communist sentiment would in later years lead to the domino effect theory, which claimed that if one nation was allowed to fall to communism, it would pave the way for many others to do the same. While the anti-communist fervor of the United States would come to be derided by later generations, the truth is that the Soviet Union very much wanted a unified communist Korea, also believing that an ultimate confrontation between democracy and communism was inevitable. And if that fight was to come, then the only way for any side to survive was to have the most allies. In short, everyone believed that World War III was inevitable. Despite the intervention of the United States and its allies, the war initially went very badly for the democratic forces. North Korean forces were backed with Soviet equipment and had received extensive training from Soviet military advisors. In fact, many of North Korea's operations were being actively planned by Soviet generals, who put their vast experience combating the Japanese in Manchuria and the Germans in Eastern Europe to great effect. North Korean forces were numerous, well-disciplined, well-equipped, and had high morale. By contrast, South Korean forces had not received much training and suffered from very poor morale. US soldiers would often find their South Korean allies fleeing from battle at the slightest provocation, and desertion was a common problem for South Korean military leaders. While the US was initially supposed to supplement South Korean forces and fight a defensive battle to push the North out of the South, they soon found themselves carrying the brunt of the battle. The extreme heat also worked against the American soldiers, who suffered from logistic and supply problems and were often forced to refill their drinking canteens from rice paddies, which had been fertilized with human waste. This led to outbreaks of disease and illness, which further decreased US strength. The US desperately needed to relieve pressure on its forces, and it was decided that an amphibious invasion behind North Korean forces would be launched. The plan was extremely risky. If the landings went poorly, then American forces would be destroyed on the beaches, overwhelmed by superior North Korean firepower. Yet if it was successful, then North Korea forces would be cut off from their supply lines and forced to fight on two fronts at the same time. Kim Il-sung, leader of North Korea, was completely aware of the vulnerability of his forces to being flanked by landings at his rear, and had even received some intel from the Soviets that American landings at Incheon were possible. Yet Kim Il-sung did not believe that the Americans would attempt such a landing, as Incheon's beaches were notoriously treacherous and difficult terrain, and its dangerous tides only afforded a few hours of safety for landing craft. On September 15th, 40,000 American troops and 8,600 South Korean troops forced a landing at Incheon, fully 100 miles behind the North's lines. The attack was a complete surprise to the North, and the landing force met with relatively light resistance. From the east, American tank battalions rushed to encircle the North Korean forces, threatening to trap the bulk of the North Korean army in the south. North Korean forces rapidly retreated back to Seoul, the South's capital, which they had seized early on in the war. A vicious battle leveled much of Seoul and saw the North's forces put in full retreat, with only 30,000 North Korean soldiers making it back to the north. The way to Pyongyang was now clear, and an end to the war was in sight. Back in the Soviet Union, Stalin berated several of his military commanders for the poor performance of the North Korean military and held them personally responsible. Some of them would not survive their failures. President Truman, however, warned that advances into North Korea should be careful not to provoke China, as he feared that it would lead to China's entry into the war and prompt the Soviets to initiate attacks in Europe, launching the much-feared democracy versus communism World War III. China's Mao Zedong had in fact warned the UN that in the case of safeguarding Chinese national security, they would intervene if necessary against UN forces in Korea. American General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the UN forces in Korea, however, was sure that China wouldn't dare risk full-out war against the US, especially given the fact that the nation still lacked any serious military hardware and relied on mass infantry formations. He also resented what he thought of as President Truman's appeasement of the Chinese, and thus, while President Truman tried to prevent war with the Chinese, General MacArthur actively tried to provoke it. Unbeknownst to MacArthur, he was about to get his wish, as for weeks now, Chinese military forces had been moving into North Korea. While UN forces had encountered various Chinese military units, these were small in size and thought to be nothing more than volunteers. Thus, General MacArthur ignored intelligence that said a growing Chinese force was massing in the mountains, believing that any Chinese in North Korea were volunteer fighters and not actual troops. Meanwhile, Stalin had been secretly communicating with Mao Zedong, telling him to send several infantry divisions into North Korea, but warning that Soviet forces would not intercede in the fight. Diplomatic discussions between Mao and Stalin led to Stalin agreeing to lend some material support but no combat troops, and that he would offer the support of the Soviet Air Force but only over Chinese airspace. This would be of little use to the Chinese forces, as none of the fighting was taking place in China itself. Still, some Soviet pilots did fly missions against UN forces, though they were careful to always remain near the Chinese border in case they were shot down. China immediately supplemented its forces in North Korea with a force of 200,000 troops, which incredibly completely evaded detection by UN aerial reconnaissance. This was achieved by marching only at nighttime and setting up elaborate camouflage while resting during the day. Strict discipline was enforced, and soldiers were to immediately duck for cover and remain motionless if any aircraft were spotted overhead. Chinese officers were authorized to shoot any security violators, and the measures, while draconian, allowed 3 divisions of Chinese infantry to completely surprise South Korean and UN forces. Deep in North Korea, Chinese forces routed a South Korean army and then completely encircled the US's 8th Cavalry Regiment, launching attacks from the north, northwest, and west. UN forces were forced to retreat, but despite the huge success of their attack, the Chinese mysteriously retreated to mountain hideouts instead of pushing the attack and capitalizing on their victory. Because of the sudden withdrawal, though, UN command did not believe that China had truly committed to the war, and thus continued to push north. This would result in another series of deadly Chinese ambushes, the most famous being the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, in which 30,000 UN troops, mostly Americans from the US's X-Corps, were surrounded by 120,000 Chinese troops. The Chinese were ordered to completely destroy UN forces. However, for 17 days, UN forces held their own under a brutal wintertime assault. Eventually, the encircled forces were able to break through the Chinese lines, and with the aid of American Marines and the US Army's Task Force faith were able to retreat. The battle would see 1,000 UN soldiers killed, with 20,000 Chinese killed, mostly due to the superior equipment and tactics of the Americans and their British and South Korean allies. The battle, however, marked the end of offensive operations in North Korea. With China fully committed, President Truman desperately wanted to avoid a third world war, and thus ordered UN forces to move back to the 38th parallel. As negotiations took place, fighting continued along the 38th parallel until finally, after 2 years of negotiations, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. A ceasefire, which lasts to this day, was immediately put into effect, but a satisfactory end to the Korean War was never achieved. Sadly, hostilities between North and South are still at an all-time high, and the continued backing of Russia and China allow North Korea, impoverished as it is, to survive. Should President Truman have risked a wider war with China in order to defeat the Communist North? Why or why not? Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video, How Do North Koreans See America? Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.